Hey guys, this is Mike Turpin of Scourge of Iron. Today we're going to go over a topic that is pretty polarizing in the scene. A lot of people have their opinions. It is going to be discussing a weightlifting belt and whether or not there are any negatives to weightlifting with a belt. To belt or not to belt, so to speak. And when I'm talking about a belt, if the first thing that pops in your mind is the thing that holds your size 28 waist or size 52 waist up, this podcast episode is not going to be for you. If what popped into your mind is that cheap piece of cloth that you wrap around your waist that you bought from Dick's Sporting Goods, it's about 2 inches tall in the front and 6 inches tall in the back and has a really strong Velcro strap that you seem to pop every time at the bottom of the squat, this podcast episode is not for you, and the only thing you're accomplishing is looking like an idiot. So, off the bat, a lot of you probably have heard people say things from training without a belt is going to help you develop a stronger core, and that training with a belt will inhibit your core strength. Well, right off the bat, we need to correct one thing. It's your use of the word core. The word core is not just your abs. And then if you say, I know, it's your lower back too. Well, you're right. It is your lower back too, but it's not just your abdominal muscles and your spinal erectors. At its most general definition, it is taking the body, removing the limbs, the arms and the legs, and it is what you are left with. It is the torso. Also included in the torso is the hip joint. So anything that motivates the hip joint is really what constitutes in your core. So any kind of flexion in the spine and anything that flexes or extends the hip joint. So you also have to include your glute muscles, your hip flexors, your adductors, your abductors. Also, I would go ahead and throw in your upper hamstring. Some people might disagree, but that is why it's such a bad word to use, is because nobody can really agree what the core means. I use it just because I hear it so much and it just comes out of my mouth. It's almost a bad habit, but if you can break yourself of that bad habit, which I'm going to try and do for the rest of this episode, if you can do that for the rest of your life, you're probably going to be better off for it. Nobody knows what you mean because nobody has the same definition, or there's no way to know that everybody has the same definition of the word core because it's so mixed up and used for various things. Okay, regardless, I digress. Okay, let's pump the brakes a little bit there, Mike. A lot of people, what they mean is what we're going to call for today your internal belt, which are the muscles that really support the spine in the area that you wear your weightlifting belt, which is your abdominal muscles, your oblique muscles, your spinal erectors. For the most part, people say they help tighten in the same way that your abdominal muscles do in the squat. They also support that the circle of muscles in that area, though. Now, I came up with the idea of this podcast episode the other day when I was was browsing through Starting Strength, edition 3 by Mark Ripito, and he had a really informative section on wearing a belt, but he presented that he believed there was to be no benefit from weightlifting without a belt, that you would develop your abdominal muscles in the same way and your spinal erectors in the same way wearing a belt as if you did not wear a belt. And it got me thinking, and I agreed with a lot of what he said, and if you own the book, you can look it up. I'm not going to read the direct quote. It's a long section, and he makes some comparisons that it got me thinking, which is always good. Anytime you say, you teach something or present something, at the very least, you either agree with it and now have learned from it, or you have thought critically and made an explanation for why you disagreed with it. So that's kind of what I did. I was at that point where, what do I think of that statement? And it made me come up with a hypothetical statement or a hypothetical situation. What I came up with, and now keep in mind my experience with a belt, is I used to lift with a belt solely, with a weightlifting belt solely when I got introduced to powerlifting. And then I was told, it's probably best not to wear the belt on your lighter sets, maybe working up till about 315 and then putting the belt on, so you can develop that internal belt, those muscles, without the belt, without relying on it, that it will build that quote unquote core that everyone talks about. But you guys know what I mean by that. And then I actually went 2 whole years without weightlifting with a belt. Absolutely no belt for 2 years. And I've recently put it on a few times, just experimenting and trying some things out and see how it felt now that it's been so long without it. If you are a power lifter and you only, train for powerlifting and that is your specific sport, maybe this isn't the best episode for you, because at the end of the day, maybe you are best off just training with a belt. That is what you do in competition. If you're a geared lifter, there's so many other elements. However, stick with me and see what you think about it. You're already about halfway through the episode anyway, so you might as well just tough it out. Okay, back to my hypothetical. We have a weightlifter who is only lifted with a belt. That's all he knows is, let's just say, the squat. Squatting with a belt. That is all this weightlifter knows. And he builds himself up to a nice, strong 500-pound squat. Low bar back squat. That's going to incorporate a lot of that torso, that lower back, because of the steep back angle at the bottom of the low bar squat, especially when you're driving your hips back. A lot of posterior chain, so it requires a lot of support in the lower lumbar region. And he gets to a 500-pound squat. And I've worked out with some people who've never squatted without a belt. I was one of them. So I would imagine if that weightlifter was to take his belt off for the very first time and try and squat without a belt, I would imagine that his 1 rep max without a belt would be around 460, maybe 450 to 460, but let's just say 460. Let's go with that number. Give him the benefit of the doubt. There are a lot of factors, though. Keep in mind, there are a lot of factors. The length of the torso is going to make it more difficult to squat without a belt. The thickness of your torso, how big of a belly you have, how thin you are. How wide your hips are, but let's just say 460. Now, you take another lifter who builds their beltless squat up. The only way they squat is without a belt, and they make it all the way to 485. And I handed them a belt, and I said, okay, we're going to throw 500 pounds on there. Here's the technique of it. Practice a few times. And maybe a week later, learning the technique of using a belt if you've never used it, because it can be uncomfortable if it's your first time using it. It can bruise you, and a lot of guys are pretty experienced with that. A lot of you guys listening are experienced with that. If not, this whole episode probably seems a little foreign to you. I would imagine that 485 squatter would now be able to squat 500 pounds with that weightlifting belt on. So, and now keep in mind, 500 pounds is a lot of weight to squat. And with that forward torso angle that we were talking about, and that much pressure and force, and it's just really difficult to support that much weight. So you do get a little bit extra out of a belt with heavier weights. I wouldn't imagine somebody only squatting 275 could get upwards to 40 pounds out of their belt. I'd imagine the numbers are much closer the lower the weight is. But once you get to numbers like 500, boy, do you get a decent amount out of that belt. However, we've created a situation where somebody's only worked without a belt and made it to the 485. So I think you hand that person a belt, and that 485 pound squatter now is able to squat 500 pounds. If you don't agree with either scenario, sorry. I'm sticking to it. Those are two scenarios that I think are extremely plausible, and I think they're pretty accurate and a good, they make a good hypothetical, I think. So, what do we have here? We have one guy who can squat 500 pounds with a belt on, but without a belt, he's only able to squat 460. And another guy who can squat 500 pounds with a belt on, but without a belt, he can squat 485. Okay. What are you thinking? You might think to yourself, but Mike, the only reason the other guy is able to squat more without the belt is because he's used to it. Well, all right. Okay. What's your point? There's still something. There's still a difference. There's got to be a reason that guy can squat more, and it has to be because he's stronger somewhere. It's not just being used to it. It's not just the technique. It's a response from the technique. It's an adaptation to the technique, to the stress in the beltless squat that he has made strength increases that the other person has not. You know, what conclusions can you draw now knowing that you might actually be stronger without a belt? Because guess what? In the real world, there is no belt. In Olympic weightlifting, you're not wearing a big, thick powerlifting belt. In strongman, a lot of times, you're not wearing a big, thick powerlifting belt. So at the very least, it is a variable that you might be able to eliminate. Because even if it is something you're using in training to do more weight, at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to use it at whatever your given sport is unless you are a power lifter. That means that the muscles specifically in that internal belt would be stronger. And guess what? There are other exercises that incorporate more of those muscles than the squat does, like the deadlift. The deadlift, depending on your anatomy and your limb lengths and everything, is probably a lot more stress on your spinal erectors than a squat is. So what you're looking at is a guy who might now be able to deadlift more as a result of the squat, of the beltless squat. And then you say, oh, but Mike, in the deadlift, you can wear a weightlifting belt. Well, that's true. But most powerlifters will tell you, and most weightlifters in general will tell you, it's much more difficult to use the belt to your advantage in a deadlift than it is a squat. It's much harder to get set up in the deadlift, pull yourself into position. If you're somebody who likes to grab the bar before you get your breath, then you can't have the belt nearly as tight as you can in the squat, because you're all mashed up in the bottom of the deadlift trying to get set up. Whereas the squat, the weight pushes you down. You get that tight torso and tight back positioning at the top of the rep while you're standing, and then you're pushed into the squat while you already have good lower back positioning. In the deadlift, you're forced to get it in the bottom, and you typically go into it with a rounded back and trying to pull yourself into a arched back before starting the rep. So you don't get as much out of your belt. It's not a spring, it's not a coil. You're starting from the bottom, and it's going to be more on your lower back, and it's harder to keep proper back positioning. And I would imagine, and I would guess, that the person who is trained in a beltless squat is going to have a better back positioning and a stronger lower back than the person who does not. And at the very least is going to have a better and easier time keeping proper positioning in the deadlift. I would go so far as to say that. As far as being able to deadlift a higher number, I don't know. I still think yes, but I would guarantee the person who's used to squatting without a belt would be able to set up in the deadlift much better and keep better technique throughout that pull than the other person and prevent injury. And then another thing you might ask is, well, I've injured my back and I've injured my abdomen, or I have this, and a lot of times it's back injury. So let's say you've injured your back and that's the reason you want to wear a belt. All right. Let me see if I can follow you for a second. So the only thing that's making your squat safe because of your back injury is a weightlifting belt? Whew. Maybe you have no business walking out the weight you're walking out with that belt. Maybe if it's a 405-pound squat and the only reason you're able to do it safely is because of your belt, maybe you need to lower the weight, start from scratch and build those muscles and rehab properly. I mean, if that's the only thing allowing you to squat is your weightlifting belt, whew, I don't know. That just seems a little, that seems a little dangerous to me, and not extremely practical, and not the most reliable, not the most reliable comfort blanket there, knowing that that's the only thing keeping you from hurting yourself, or so you think. Give it a couple of months, give it a year, see what happens. Another thing to consider is how you use your belt. A lot of people are taught to press their stomach outwards against their weightlifting belt to use the belt properly. Well, I am not going to dispute the way that you should use your weightlifting belt. If you're a power lifter and you think you're stronger in a squat by pressing your stomach out, that's fine. But I will tell you this, it's probably going to be even more counterproductive to your strength without a belt. And that's where you might have problems in your internal belt, when you're trying to squat without a belt, is because you've taught yourself to squat by pressing your stomach out. And the appropriate way to support your spinal cord is to keep all of those muscles as tight as possible. You're supposed to keep a tight, you're supposed to keep tight abdominal muscles while squatting for the strongest, most supported, stabilized back positioning in the squat. So if you have only squatted by pressing your stomach out with a belt and now you take a belt off, it's going to be bad news. You're probably going to hurt yourself and you're going to have a very tough time keeping an arched back. So that's another thing to consider. I would recommend, unless you are a powerlifter who is very, very, very adamant about driving your stomach outward, if you were just training for strength in general and you are just a gym rat, I would definitely recommend just keeping your torso as tight as you can from every angle, keeping your internal belt as tight, pulled in towards your spinal cord as possible, as opposed to pressing it out while you're using your belt, and just take the added weight that the belt gives, because at least then you are working your internal belt while wearing a weightlifting belt. If you guys have followed me so far, awesome. I will tell you that what I'm saying is not an exact science. It is not gospel. And what I've said so far represents my opinions very well. There are many other angles to take it. If you're listening, you might be coming up with hypotheticals of your own, which is great, because my word is meant to make you think critically, whether in agreement or against what I'm saying. And I'll tell you a good argument if you aren't really agreeing with what I'm saying. I'll tell you a good argument against what I'm saying is that the fact that you're now doing more weight wearing a belt, and there are benefits to wearing a belt for overall strength, because if your internal belt muscles are what's keeping you from squatting heavier weight, and let's say you're only squatting 475, or, even let's just say you're only squatting 315 without the belt, and you've kind of plateaued, and you always fatigue due to your torso and your lower back and your abdomen. And now you put a belt on and you can do 350. Well, now that's a lot more stress and a lot more weight that's traveling through your hip muscles, your glute muscles, your hamstrings, your quads. So all of those other muscles that might have been kind of not worked to their full potential when you weren't wearing your belt are now working harder and are going to get stronger. So there are a lot of things to consider, and I am not telling you guys an exact science, but I would stand by my ground and say, if I was a betting man, I would say you are going to be stronger as a result of weightlifting without a belt. And then if you wanted to see what you could do with a belt, maybe go an 8 to 12 week training program of working with the belt to handle that heavier weight, and to maybe train for a meet or see what your 1 rep max is with one. And then, go back to making sure you're getting the work in without the belt. That's what I would recommend. And if it did get to the point where you felt like your torso was weak and fatigued, and every time I go to squat, it's because of a weak torso and it's hard for me to keep back positioning, well, then maybe instead of throwing the belt on like a cop out, maybe it's time to start working those muscles. Maybe it's time to start doing some hyperextensions, some weighted hyperextensions, some, leg raises, planks, good mornings. All of those things are great ways to work the muscles in that internal belt and keep back positioning in the squat. So, yeah, thank you guys for listening. You can check out the Facebook group Scourge of Iron, and it's run by a guy named Josh McIntyre, a really good guy. There's a lot of guys who post on there, a lot of buddies of mine, a lot of weightlifters from various sports. So go ahead and get on there and get at us and post what you think, and post some videos of you weightlifting and philosophy and all that kind of good stuff, and training logs, and we'll keep in touch. All right. Thanks. See you guys soon.